though you're not interested in mechanism, I presume that when you were talking about precision in categorization or in measurement, using the same instrument or similar instruments to measure across cohorts. But the thing is, how has context changed in regarding mental health from the 1970s to nowadays? Like, I don't think we even have. And Jordan was talking about the cultural milieu and the whole set of normative rules that somehow are like a greater context that provides meta contingencies for other smaller or more specific rules that we follow. And I think it could be argued that the current content regarding mental health and cultural notions regarding mental health are not even close to what they were in the 70s. I mean, some things, of course, hold. I mean, psychiatry exists, and it existed in the 70s, but it has changed. I mean, you can see it even like when people talk much more openly about mental health issues, which I don't know if eventually will be positive or not.
Yeah.
Like, see what I mean? Like, it's people now are much more perhaps. Maybe I'm talking from the point of view of the Spanish cultural complex. In the 1970s, most people would have no idea what a psychologist is. And nowadays, I would say a substantial amount of teenagers go to therapy and are very open about their mental health and are very focused on their mental health, which I'm not sure is entirely beneficial. But I guess all of those contextual changes across time might have a lot to do with how they rate their mental health over.
Absolutely. I mean, that's something we're concerned with and have tested as much as it's possible to test. So looking at kind of the measurement equivalence of instruments psychometrically over time, you can determine whether there are systematic differences in measurement error of specific items across time. So for instance, people from different generations might answer specific questions within an instrument in different ways. So you can kind of partialize out that variance from the kind of the differences in the latent construct itself, looking at latent differences in the means over time. Now, what's driving that difference at the construct level? We don't really have any way of knowing. Is it people are actually more distressed nowadays? Is it the case that overall people are just generally more aware of mental health, more willing to talk about it, more willing to report? Or in all likelihood, possibly a bit of both. And again, it probably varies on an individual basis. But I do think these things are important to be aware of, I guess, how these things are changing over time, because they can, at the end of the day, if more people than ever are saying that they're suffering from mental health problems, then that has policy implications, because that needs to be addressed. Yeah.
I'll add a little bit to that as well, because that's also the issue we're facing when it comes to like all of our socioeconomic indicators, where the social context of, living in social housing in the 1970s, especially in the UK, is completely different to today, because our public housing policies changed entirely after Margaret Thatcher and everything. So if you lived in social housing in the 1970s, that means something completely different to living in social housing today. So we're not necessarily expecting that the context is the same over time. It's more to map how it's changing. But I think in terms of like mental health, that's a very valid point that, how many people were talking about depression in the 70s and, that sort of stuff to today. And there's been some very good work by Collishaw in particular, where he's looked at those individual items and everything like that. And he makes the argument, and I think it's a pretty interesting one, that if it was generally just due to people being more open or more knowledgeable or any of those things, we would see an increase across all of these items over time, like in general. But it's only specific items that you're starting to see these increases. So it's not a general effect of just knowledge overall. It's more specific than that. And I think, I mean, obviously it's a very early area of work and everything, but I think there's a bit of implication that it's not solely due to just an increase in knowledge, or else we'd see kind of a more overall general effect and increase. But that's kind of, it's the context is changing, but how is basically what we're trying to address.
Just some different questions we received here from the chat. Maria is saying, I'm curious as if in Jordan's studies, was trauma a variable or was it measured? And what is the thought on how that is affecting individuals? You're muted.
Okay, sorry. I think that is a great question. Right. And so the first one was it measured? No. So trauma and responding in the context of trauma is not something that we've started to unpack from this density perspective. But I do believe that it's an area that could be incredibly advantageous. If I were to posit a guess about what would occur in such a series of studies, it would be that trauma, because of the powerful affective relations that are operating within that space, very quickly become high mass networks. And those high mass networks are then, if left untreated, something that the rest of your experience for the rest of your life starts to organize around. So if you think of that rule governed behavior study, where the other stimuli organized around the capital E to lower e and capital R to lower r, I would guess that those traumatic experiences become the capital E to little e, and capital R to little r, where now your whole experience starts to build around those traumatic events. And I think at some level that's adaptive, because in the absence of a contingency shift, you're still in that traumatic experience. It's still occurring. And so relationally responding to that experience in that way is an adaptive process. It's the way to escape or the way to avoid. The challenge becomes then in the context of the contingency shift. So once you're out of that traumatic experience and now into a safe space, for example, in war veterans who may have experienced trauma on the battlefield but are now reintegrated into society, the contingencies shift, and the challenge is, has that network become so resistant to change that you're still responding as if you're in the war zone while you're in the civilization? And so what do we do instead? And so in the absence of being able to take away that history, what we can do is potentially start to build those like multiple high mass, psychologically flexible relational response repertoires that you're able to draw into in context. And so yes, trauma, and what do I value in this moment? In this moment, noticing this thing occurring, can I bring myself back into the present moment, which involves a lot of relational behavior to do so, and then reorient to other stimuli in the environment that are immediately here now, instead of events happening there then, and the kind of thoughts that whirl into trying to solve a problem in the future that might not even be there. And so I think that's where that research line could go. And if anybody wanted to dive into trauma and relational density, I mean, I'm here. I think that would be fantastic and incredibly important.
Thank you.
So we also had someone waiting to ask a question. Let me just find the person.
I'd like to ask a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, good. This is for Jordan. I wonder how you would respond to the criticism that, even though I don't know very much about relational density theory, the criticism that this is just using different words for the same thing. For example, you talked about disruptors, and all the disruptors were what some other people call treatments, like differential reinforcement, increasing effort, diffusion, extinction, reinforcement for values, more reinforcers, less punishers, that type of thing is is that something that you could respond to?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the surface, I would probably agree with the criticism, in the sense that what we're observing in our more basic and translational research that is specifying those terms in measurable dimensional units is arriving at the same outcomes that we're seeing in things like research on different behavior therapies applied in different clinical contexts. So I think in a sense that's a strength and not a weakness of it. We should be seeing convergent findings, and at least at the initial condition that we're obtaining convergent findings with what's being seen in the room and in the clinical therapies that we're developing is a good thing. And I think that when we're adjusting the language to be more specific about the different elements, so what is the counterforce? Well, we can talk about that broadly as counterforce, or we can talk about that specifically as a specific schedule of reinforcement or an amount of exposure to a relational training. One of the questions that came up during a student poster was, why use the stimulus pairing procedure instead of using a traditional match to sample? And the reason that we did that in the initial study was to hold negative X constant. As soon as we have a match to sample, negative X is no longer constant because response accuracy is conflated with the rate of reinforcement. The more accurate you're responding, the more reinforcements you're receiving for that accurate responding. So negative X in the equation becomes a broad idea that can then be collapsed into specific measurable dimension units that then in our basic studies, we can adjust, hold this element constant, vary this element, hold this element constant, vary this element. And hopefully what we're able to do is, right now a major criticism of technologies or frameworks or approaches such as ACT is that the bridge from RFT to ACT is too far. What we're seeing in the basic RFT labs might be incoherent with what we're actually doing in something like ACT. And how many people doing ACT are familiar with RFT, and how many people who are doing RFT are familiar with ACT. And so we have this large gap. My thought is that if we can adjust our terminology slightly in a way that allows us to get to higher order relational patterns, analogous to what's being attempted with the HDML and largely informed by it, then what we can start to do is bridge the gap between our basic conceptual understanding of relational framing and the types of things that we're observing in the clinic, and potentially come up with new technologies or new approaches to the same problems if those basic research studies yield anomalies.
You're not suggesting new behavior principles. You're talking about more precise terminology, more precise measurement.
I'm looking at it more as a way to tap into those higher order patterns of relational responding. Yeah. So I think behavioral momentum theory gives the perfect example of using resistance in the equation as another dimension upon which to talk about behavior. So in our case, we're extending that to talk about the resistance of relational behavior, and then using the Newtonian strategy to kind of speak to volume and density, which, yeah, like relational strength and nodal distance and volume have already been shown to be things that influence relational behavior. So yeah, it's definitely not saying that the historical literature is incorrect, quite the opposite. Viewed in this way, the things that we've learned are immensely beneficial. It just allows us a language to talk about it more abstractly and at a higher level.
Thanks.
Yep.
That was an interesting point. I'm thinking here, are we talking about something different than the principles of behavior or not?
No.
But I guess the pragmatic element is very interesting, because to me it is mind-blowing. As someone posted a comment saying, I was thinking the same thing. It's mind-blowing when we were listening to you. And of course, maybe we are, at the end of the day, we're talking about the same basic principles. But I mean, if our discourse is forever just going to be about what, finding the basic principles, where are we going with that?
Yeah, I mean, go ahead.
No, please, Jordan, go ahead.
Oh, sure. All I was going to add is that I think as we're moving into complexity and complex systems, It's the higher order patterns that become most relevant. Those higher order patterns most likely being selected by the same principles. And so relational frame theory, I think, dealt with the same thing, which was, okay, so derived relational responding is occurring, why? And the reason why, of course, was generalized, it's a generalized operant maintained by reinforcement for relational responding in that way. And so, okay, so let's say we do tend to respond to external stimuli in terms of relational networks that contain more relations and that those relations are stronger and more established. Okay, great. Why do we do so? Probably to obtain reinforcement and to avoid punishment. And so it all comes back to the same basic principles, but the organization or the structures contained within it, I think, become highly relevant and allow us a degree of prediction and influence with more precision, scope, and depth.
What I was going to say is I see that relational density theory is a vibrant research program. I mean, it's in a short time, it has produced lots of findings, to the point that sometimes it's even difficult to follow the to catch up with the level of publication. In using the Newtonian analogy, it's not that I'm super familiar with the theory. I've read a few things, but I always have this feeling that I don't really see to which extent the need for the analogy, and because basically volume, density, and mass end up referring to aspects of relational networks that somehow were already conceptualized in terms of either number of stimuli, number of relations, or nodal distance. So even the very definition of volume, as far as I know, I don't have a clear idea if it has to do with nodal distance or it's the number of relations, because I would think of the number of relations as an indicator of relational mass. But I don't really think I have a clear idea what relational mass is, and I think that would be key, because actually, if you go to physics, density is basically about mass. So I mean, it's all related, but what I'm trying to say is I don't know to which extent you get something beyond, and I'm saying this with utmost respect for the theory and the research effort. You get more than what you get with other more traditional terminology in characterizing relational networks or equivalence classes. I don't know. I would like to know Jordan's opinion.
Yeah, I think that is a great. I think it's a great question. In the original paper with Mark and I, and kind of summarizing the introduction of the dissertation, the main thing was to talk about, could we get at resistance as a dimension of relational behavior? And behavioral momentum theory, I think, gives us a really parsimonious account of what resistance could be referred to as. So for resistance, you need two things. You need the response itself, and then you need some aspect of the environment, because it's going to be resistance to change, but resistance to what? And so resistance to some sort of external influence. So right there, I think the Newtonian metaphor is like allows for a parsimonious shorthand for what is resistance. So it's a change in something equal to a disruptor over mass. So then that begs the question, then what is mass? And so where that kind of leads us to is in behavioral momentum theory, they generally hypothesize that mass was based on primarily a history of reinforcement for the response. So the greater the history of reinforcement for the response, the more resistant it's going to be to change. Therefore, mass should be higher. That makes it more resistant to the disruptor. Now, as they dug further into what are things that contribute to mass, it turned out it wasn't just that. Other things that contributed to mass were the number of responses that were available that served the same function. So if you had several responses that were available that served the same function inside of a response hierarchy, then the response class itself tended to be more resistant to change because, for example, if your disruptor is extinction, then you tend to go from one response to the next and then to the next. And once you've kind of exhausted this response hierarchy, then you might flip over to a different response class that is then itself contacting a different sort of reinforcement. So that's all well and good. Another thing that they figured out was that intermittent schedules of reinforcement also tend to produce greater resistance to change. And so if something's on a continuous reinforcement schedule, although it has a greater reinforcement history, it tends to be less resistant to change, possibly because the contingency shift is easier to detect. When you're getting reinforcement every single time, and then it goes to extinction, right? It's pretty clear that you're not going to get reinforcement for that thing and potentially for that class. So the point is that when we're talking about it at a lower level, we can dive into the research and we start to see all of these things. We see resurgence, we see relapse, we see renewal within the behavioral momentum theory research. But all of those things collapse together and produce mass. And I think what mass begs the question is what are those interactions of all of those lower level events? And so from a pragmatic lens, the conceptualization allows to then orient a productive research line to understanding those interacting elements, conceptualized more broadly as mass. And so to us here in the relational density theory thing, what is volume and what is density? Who knows? I mean, it's all made up, right? Everything we're talking about in science is made up. Science is just behavior that we engage in to solve problems. So for us, a logical way to go about it is to say, well, density is the strength of the bonds of the elements, and only because that's consistent with how it's talked about in physics. And then in volume, well, what the heck is that? And we have that research on nodal distance. We have the research on class sizes, even when the nodes are held constant. All that stuff is there. Nodes and class size both kind of seem to interact and do a thing. So that matters too. The more nodes, the less density, right? If it's a linear training arrangement versus many to one. So again, it opens up a line of research into what constitutes relational mass. And so I think the density times volume is a starting point. It's probably too abstract than what it would need to eventually be. But I think that's part of approaching it inductively, in the sense of, well, let's test it. Let's run the experiment. Let's see what lands. And if the theory as we conceptualized it back in 2020 is what it is in 2030, then I think we failed. So I hope that we're wrong in its initial conceptualization, but I also hope that the conceptualization leads to some really important research on the relational field.
As you were talking about what mass and volume is, which was my question, but I guess you answered it. I was going to ask how exactly to measure mass and volume, because I guess that's kind of your question too. Is it the nodal distance? Is it the... But then, as you were saying, I was thinking, okay, is it then derivation? Is it the derivation and flexibility and all the elements of the HDML model? But I guess you answered it. It's whatever it. I understand better now that it's really just a metaphor to guide, I guess, clinical practice and other pragmatically relevant activities.
And hopefully basic research as well. How does it integrate with the language used in the HDML? I mean, it's a common enough question, right? And I think the best answer that I can give is right now both research lines are based on a dense history of research literature on basic research in relational framing. Both are guiding specific research questions, and to this point, I think both are yielding outcomes that are similar. And so we're getting convergent findings, meaning both frameworks are probably arriving at the same sorts of conclusions. So we don't have those divergent findings that would support one thing necessarily over the other. So in essence, we are probably talking about the same things, a lot of ways using different language. At the same time, I think we're at a point of immense variability in tackling issues of relational complexity, because historically we've hung on to relational simplicity. And so as we hit into relational complexity, I think variability in language is helpful because they produce multiple research lines. At some point, as more and more results come in, and I know Dermot's group is so radically empirical and I love it, and we try to be that way too, we'll eventually have enough findings that we can start to then come together, I think, and talk about how these languages, what is the most precise use of a term like derivation or coherence, for example.
Well, if that's the case, I guess that kind of, to me, brings the argument of then if it's going to arrive from empirical data and we're going to reanalyze it and restudy it, our data in the future, then I guess we need to actually do the kinds of things that people are, the whole open science, keep your data in a way that, in future someone else can grab it, understand what that is, and rethink about it. Right.
I think I'll just add something to that. I think Jordan's right that the HTML and RDT, one is a theory in that it's got equations to make predictions. HTML is just a framework. It doesn't make any predictions. It just said, so they're different in that respect. But I think you can manipulate the dimensions and even the levels as a way of generating the higher order constructs that Jordan talks about in RDT. So, you increase coherence as it's defined within the HTML, then that should feed in principle to coherence as analyzed within RDT, and flexibility as resistance and so on. But they're not the same terms for the same things. One is a framework generated from terms that were already existed in RFT, and one is, as Jordan points out, is an extension of it towards making specific predictions about what happens to behavior when you do one of the other things. The HTML makes no predictions about what will happen.
Right. So does RDT?
Yeah.
If I don't know, maybe Jordan doesn't agree, but I think.
No, I agree. Yeah, I agree 100%. Absolutely right. If we increase volume and hold density constant, we should see more resistance to change. However, if you increase volume without increasing exposure, you might see a reduction in density. And that's consistent with density equals relational mass over relational volume. So those things, yes, absolutely. The predictions are directional. We try to move elements by holding other elements constant. And so far it's held mostly, except for the example of the rule-governed behavior study, where we're starting to hit the anomalies, and those anomalies seem to be relational entanglement. And we're starting to run into issues where we haven't paid enough attention to the C-rel. But that was by design, right? I mean, Dermot, you remember back to the dissertation proposal, it was let's start with coordination and see what happens. And so we started with coordination, we're seeing what happens, but the C-rels are becoming increasingly relevant and the C-funcs are becoming increasingly relevant. And so it's gonna, kind of push us into those areas as well. And how to even conceptualize those is a bit of a mind trip. You get into entanglement, relational multiverse, I don't know. Eventually you feel like you're in like Marvel or something.
One of the things that I was thinking as well was that, the same way that someone said, well, it all boils down to reinforcement and extension and all the basic processes. The same thing I was thinking in the realm of network analysis is, well, at the end of the day, maybe it all boils down to correlation. So, if you just, it's an increasingly complex way of doing correlations, but at the end of the day, it's the same thing that Pearson did 100 years ago. But I was thinking, well, it's a very powerful data analytic method. You need, thousands of participants, I guess, usually. You can, no, you can run in a small data set as well.
Well, you need, depends, power is poorly studied in the network models that I've mentioned today. Really, it depends. There's no rule of thumb. You need X amount of participants because it depends on the size of the effect you're expecting to detect. It depends on how many nodes are in your model. Some of the machine learning techniques that are typically used are supposedly there to correct for those problems, the lasso regressions and things like that. Again, derived from techniques used in physics where you often have, you're estimating more parameters than you have data points. So
So
yeah.
there's kind of always a way around that.
Yeah.
Right. But what I was thinking is, seeing Jordan's presentation right after Owen's presentation, I was thinking, it seems to suit, right? If you just use that analytic tool to that type of data. I mean, it seems to someday you're just going to run network analyses over these clusters of stimuli. Do you think that's a possibility, Jordan?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when, Owen's presentation essentially was borrowing from graph theory in the sense of nodes and edges, and what is a node and an edge. So essentially, when you're looking at the MDS, you have the stimuli, your nodes, and then you have the distance between them represented by edges. Instead of the thickness of the line being an indicator of strength, it's the distance between the two edges that are an indicator of strength. But theoretically, you could take that exact same data and graph it as a network that contains nodes and edges where the strength is the thickness of the line. It would be the same thing, just analyzed in a different way.
Right.
But I will say what Owen did, which was so cool, is it has that temporal dimension. And in the context of Owen's talk, that's really awesome when you're talking about like disorders because what have we done with the DSM? We've come up with a taxonomy to sort the disorders as they exist today. But if you think of like evolution as a metaphor too, for Darwin, it was noticing the temporal patterns that mattered. It wasn't just how do these things cluster today, but it's how do they evolve over time. And yes, they're kind of sorted in this way maybe, but they evolve. And one thing evolves into the next, and one thing evolves into the next, and so you end up with evolutionary theory. I think that temporal density is going to be increasingly relevant. So like the multidimensional scale that you're seeing is like a slice of an onion at a moment in time. But eventually we need to get to how is that relational network evolving through time as far as like temporal stability goes, temporal stability, temporal instability, bifurcations, variation. Where does that variation play into selection and retention mechanisms that are contained in the environment? Suddenly negative X becomes a correlation between the environment and the behavior as it's ebbing and flowing through time. So I think that temporal piece that Owen was getting at is going to be critically important in the future of this thing. Now, I need people who are smarter than me to know how to analyze it. It takes a lot of data and information even to get the slice. And so that's another challenge. So we'll see. I'd love to collaborate on getting at that temporal density piece. Time matters.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something, I guess, traditionally in psychiatry has been studied to a degree, but relying on previous kind of DSM style classifications. When we're assessing mental health problems in children, we often assign different labels to disorders, and then use entirely different labels for essentially the same thing in adulthood. So yesterday's oppositional defiant disorder becomes tomorrow's conduct disorder, but that's probably because when you're an adult, there are different ways or different contexts for which your kind of behaviors and symptoms actually are expressed. You might get grounded as a child or detention for kind of externalizing behaviors, but then when you're an adult, you end up in prison or something like that. So yeah, I think moving away from the onion slice and trying to get the whole developmental picture is really important.
One thing I liked a lot about your presentation was when you showed data, the difference between the group data and the individual and the variance that within the individual you observe as well, and how that contributes. That reminds me of your 2021 paper, which, there is a group effect that you observe with the physiological measure. Well, at the group level, the physiological measures seem to show a transformation of functions. But if you look at individual each individual, maybe not they're not perfectly showing that, because you need all these steps. You need, they show, they learn that via direct contingencies, then they show transformational functions, and then you shift the contingencies, and then so on and so forth. So at the group level, it seems like everything works, but then maybe when you look at participants, that doesn't really. So not for everybody. So I think that's one thing interesting about analyzing data, looking at group and individuals and seeing what is going on with individuals as well, as because individuals themselves show their own variance, and they alone are a whole study if you look at it that way.
Yeah, no, I think it's very interesting, and yes, we had most studies on fear conditioning, or the mainstream literature on fear conditioning, uses group designs and statistical inference. So obviously, from a behavior analytic point of view, what you're trying to see is if you get, especially in these kind of proof of concept studies, if the contextual manipulations that you are implementing basically will produce the effect, transfer effect, or a transformation effect. So that's why you have individual criteria. The idea is, okay, this individual with this history of learning, we assume would show transformational functions. Psychophysiological measures are inherently variable, so they are very noisy, and not only very noisy, they are very sensitive to lots of influences. So if you have someone, even skin conductance, which is the simplest you could possibly measure, like you just think of something, or you hear a noise, unexpected noise, whatever, you will see an increase. So it's just difficult to isolate that at the individual level.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to have both measures, because in the general fear conditioning literature, many effects that are taken for granted, perhaps when they're analyzed at more molecular or individual level, they are not so clear. And in Owen's case, I like a lot also the representation of how the correlation, the entire correlation changes its direction, whether it's individual or group. Of course, it's, in my view, that's the way to go. I mean,
yeah, I mean,
multiple.
Like I said, I came across that particular Hammaker paper about 5 years ago, and I had done a lot of cross-sectional work. I had done sort of traditional longitudinal work, just because you have a couple of repeated measures. If you're not taking in the kind of the nested structure, if you're just having somebody's situation at time point 1 predicting time point 2, at the group level, you're still not separating out the between person variation from the within person variation. And like I said, when we're thinking about mechanisms, it's always the within person variation that we're almost certainly most interested in. And yeah, traditionally, again, at least in my field, we've not been very good at we've not been using the correct methods, I guess, to get at that. But yeah, like I said, it does seem to be changing.
I think there's a certain irony in the current context for that, because it was Owen who made a big, really focused on the importance of N1 and the analysis of individuals, and yet to a certain extent, certainly within contextual behavioral science, that focus, maybe until very recently, has been lost. So it was, our intellectual heroes in behavior analysis, like Murray Sidman, who banged on the table about single subject design, etc. And yet it seems to be non-behavioral folks who are discovering that, while the behavioral folks are losing sight of it, or have until recently. Now that would be controversial in certain quarters, I'm sure, in my grouping, but it is, in fact, I remember we attended, myself and Yvonne went to a meeting, it must be begin about 2015 in Boston when Steve Hayes and Stefan Hoffman first built out what has now become the EAM. I was in the room when it was constructed, and it was a bit like DSM, just a bunch of old blokes and, well, a few women, but mostly old blokes making stuff up. And you know, there was a person in the room. I can't remember his name now, but he was not behaviorally trained, behavioral analyst, and he was really excited about this whole idea of the focus on the individual in clinical psychology, just as you're articulating here. I think it's a lesson that behavioral folks, those including myself, who went down the group design thing with the IRAP and so on, would be very wise to focus on. And I know Jordan, for example, is working with the GIMI in the context of doing doing RDT type work using the GIMI, which is basically a methodology for looking at taking various exactly what you're talking about. But I can't help but feel a slight irony in that the non-behavioral person in the room is telling us about the importance of individual participant research, and good. I hope our behavioral colleagues who have lost that sight are listening to you, Owen. Just one more thing that I don't want to hog the space, but I was just having come back from ABAI, and I went to a tutorial by Billy Baum, who's one of the most senior folks in behavioral analysis, both in age and in intellectual prestige. And he argued in his tutorial for abandoning in behavioral analysis the concept of reinforcement and the concept of strength, and replacing them with allocation, induction, and correlation, interestingly. So I think there's some convergence there as well. The basic idea is that every day, every organism, they wake up and they've got a certain amount of resources to allocate to their day. They've got to go out and get food. They've got to spend time conspecifics. They've got to engage in self-health behaviors, grooming and so on, or washing and blah blah blah, all the different, and they have to sleep. And so evolutionarily, you have this range of things you have to do, and that's basically your phylogeny. This is what you have to do. Along comes the environment and induces various behaviors that are relevant to the things that you have to achieve. So if you haven't eaten for a while and there's food available in the vicinity, then you start to forage. Most of this is animal-based, but you can apply these things to human behavior as well. And so that induces this type of behavior. If there's a group activity, then that induces socializing. If you find that you're not clean or whatever, then you engage in grooming behaviors and what have you. And then the correlation of what he calls covariation comes in the way the environment selects out these phylogenetically induced behaviors, and then you adapt to your environment across the day, across the weeks, across the years, and so on, and that's what shapes behavior. And you don't need the concept of reinforcement, you don't need the concept of strength, because you can bury this inside of a very strong evolutionary scientific framework. And it's controversial people were sort of shocked and so on. It's been going on for this some time, but people in the audience were, oh, well, get rid of reinforcement in behavioral analysis. I think could do that, and replace it with this. But it was compelling. It was very compelling indeed. And I think that certainly I think broadly speaking, burying these things in sort of an evolutionary perspective, because there was discussion before about how the culture has changed. And thinking about what is it what are the main things that humans have to gain access to, and how have things changed in terms of modern technology, social media. For example, when I was at school, if you got bullied at school, you ran home and you were safe at home. But now, because of social media, the bully can chase you on social media and so on. So that changes the context for bullying. It's just one of many examples how those sorts of things adapt. So thinking in those terms, it would be nice. I think there could be advantages in thinking in that way more, letting go maybe so much of things like reinforcement and strength, not in the way that George's talking about it, but generally trying to integrate what the sort of approach that Billy's talking about, Billy Baum, and having a more seamless connection between psychology, whether it's behavioral analysis or whatever, and the role that our evolutionary history brings to bear. So why is mental health worse and increasingly worse? What is it about our modern world that is, inducing behaviors that perhaps aren't considered to be, healthy and adaptive and so on. Now, I'm not a Luddite. I'm not saying that everything in the modern world is bad, but nonetheless, it could be, I think, it could be instructional to think about the role that evolution as basically primates, think of how quickly time has changed, and even in my lifetime, the reliance on technology, we're further removed from the physical world and physical interactions and so on than we would have been. And if you go back even 100 years, the difference between where people were at 100 years ago and 500 years ago is probably tiny relative to where people were even 100 years ago and today. There's a massive change, and the impact that has on so-called mental health, because are we adapting as advanced primates as quickly as we might to the constraints and demands of a modern world? Anyway, that's just a general view and a calling out for Billy Baum and his incredibly impressive tutorial when I was in America last week.
Folks, I guess it's about time for us to wrap it up. I would like to thank again everybody involved, especially Keelan this morning. So Miguel arrived and I didn't know where he was, if everything was okay. Keelan picked him up, and I didn't realize before you sent me a message that you didn't have each other's contact. So how would you know? So anyway, everything worked out at the end of the day, which is amazing, brilliant. And to quote Jordan, I think we slayed. I'm just praising myself here. That's so embarrassing, but anyway. But I actually have a fan that says slay, and it makes that sound. So I should have brought it. If I knew you were going to mention it, I should have opened it now at the end. Even though every time I try to open it, it falls to the floor. So it's embarrassing because I don't know how to open a fan in a way that makes sounds. But before you go, the School of Psychology, who is sponsoring and organizing everything, would like to send a gift to each one of you. So I'll just pick up the gifts to each one of the presenters. I guess we were going to have to ship Jordan's over to America. Right, so I guess they are not different from each other. So that's yours. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much.
That's yours.
Thanks, Jordan.
And Jordan, that's yours. There you
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rose.
Ready? I'm gonna put Jordan there in a way that camera's always capturing. That's yours. Right. We're gonna figure out a way to send it over. If nobody else has anything to say,
so just one thing. This had basically nothing to do with me. It was all Rodrigo. So I was, it's all his work. Nothing. I went missing in action last week anyway.
Except that he gave me important insights. I did start doing things without him knowing at the very beginning, which is not something you should do in Ulster University. You need to let your supervisor know about everything you're doing. But I eventually let him know, and he did help a lot with suggestions and insights that were very, very important. It was, for example, brilliant to bring Jordan to this discussion, because I came with it. I was just thinking, well, I see that there is something in there. It's going to get somewhere that, where someday, maybe in 100 years, where psychology is going to finally be starting to talk about the same thing and go in somewhere and have some sort of common ground and actually lead somewhere and actually help people without figuring out that they were actually doing the opposite someday. But yeah, so I guess we need to wrap it up. And thanks everybody for coming. This is recorded. Someone asked it. I'm going to send over the recordings to whoever I have their emails, whoever was registered. I have their emails. If not, send me an email. I'm also going to write everything that people spoke, and this is going to be written down in a book of proceedings, right?
Good luck with that.
I've done that before,
You can do that after you finish your PhD.
Yes, good point. All right, folks, I'll let you go. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rodrigo.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.